And one of the common factors, and to my mind the biggest, was that for most of those decades there was an identifiable groups of people who worked together, formally or informally, across government, academia and industry and civil society, who really kept at it, who moved, some of them moved between those sectors, some of them just worked closely across them. And I mean, you know, it reinforces the value of those kind of conversations. So in a sense, you have to have the motive force for people to care about climate change and care about fluid framings, but somehow that's to keep that kind of group going, but actually that group has to go out into other debates that are about conflict or, you know, equality or transport or whatever it might be, and not talk about the general.
I mean, one of the things that we've seen with sustainability as an issue, for example, is become marginalised and stuck in a box. There's a little thing that sits alongside everything else, and it's got stuck in that box, I would say.
So you were going to say, the name of the report?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the body is called the Institute for Government, and the report is called the S Factor. S for success, S hyphen factor.
Thanks. Sorry, Julie. It's actually...
lost the thread. So now I was just getting engaged in that one. But I kind of wanted to go back to, towards the end of your talk, you were talking about different visions and then some being realized and some not. And I was thinking a little bit about that, and kind of related to what kind of futures thinking informs policy. And also, so some reflections about, and also just kind of being inspired by what you were saying, about, you were touching about that earlier a little bit, about whether UK was quite progressive, or they have the kind of the structure and having foresight and future thinking informing policy, and how that compares to other countries. And then also kind of tagging if that has anything to do with how is the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement coming into the picture, if that enables or kind of reinforces governments to try to use futures thinking at all.
Gosh.
There's a lot in there. Kind of a lot of thoughts.
So what did you start with?
About what visions.
So this is also available. All the foresight stuff is online on the government archives. There's the paper that I referenced is really worth a read if you're interested in futures work. So each foresight project has a whole stack of scholarly articles associated with it. This is some people from Lancaster University who looked at 100 years of futures thinking in cities, so the whole of the 20th century. And they begin to pull out national differences. So in particular, the UK is the only place where the Garden City essentially has of their study. But the French and US have got the grid. You can see a more continuous line of thinking around kind of grid planning, for example. So that's one thing. What it doesn't do, the paper, because that's a much bigger question, is really examine why, other than the fact that, you know, kind of Britain has a view of itself as a beautiful place and with, you know, quite affinity with the countryside, at least historically, and kind of nostalgia and love actually for the countryside. But kind of, you know, how does that relate to the kind of hardcore matters of futures of cities? The city stuff is true. I mean, policy is a very broad word. Obviously, it means a whole lot of very different things. Cities, the design of cities has tended to be more a matter of regional and local consent. So in fact, it hasn't been Westminster. In the UK, the centre has not, by and large, designed cities. So the futures thinking and the cities has actually been around often kind of civil, financial, to a certain extent democratic imagination. So it's kind of an interesting and more distributed process across sectors, but geographically located. One of the reasons we were doing the national project on the futures of cities was because there had been none of that at the national level, and the problem with the laissez-faire approach to cities at a national level is you end up with London, and London, and London. So a big question for the UK is basically how far the success of London in economic and social terms might have been to the detriment of other parts of the country, and that was a question we were trying to answer, which we didn't answer. But there hadn't been any national for futures work on cities in the city system. There is some work going on in Germany, I believe, about, because there's on cities, which I think are completely fascinating and incredibly important from a sustainable development point of view. There's quite a lot of thinking about cities and futures, but it tends to have come out of particularly the US thinking. And in the US, the cities are far enough apart that you can think of each of them as a separate entity. And for the rest of us, that's not true. So you can't think of cities in the UK nor in Germany as separate entities. You have to think about them in connection with each other. And that's, to your point, that is another level of kind of how do you get that decision and discussion over here related to that one over there. I don't think I've answered everything you said, but...
There were a lot of questions. We can say no too.
Thanks so much. My name is Niklas, and I've been involved with CEMUS forever, but also... well, I've been involved with this place, CEMUS, for but also worked a lot on new technologies and the introduction of new technologies in society, and sort of been trying to facilitate processes of investigating what's sort of on the cards. And so a million things to discuss here, I feel. But one thing I was wondering about from your work, especially on that topic of governances into scientists and the public, the sort of issue around risk and the sort of seriousness of the whole set of issues we're grappling with climate change, but also a whole set of new technologies. What's your sort of thinking around that? Because I think generally we see a trend where scientists are not comfortable speaking to the actuality of many of these risks. It's a bit shaky, you have tipping points, it's not precise science, etc., etc. But also underlying that is like you rock the boat too much, because you know inherently the implications are basically a systems change that is going to have very, very severe consequences on our economies, on power, vested interests, politicians you're speaking to, etc. So the kind of subconscious or conscious kind of downplaying of a lot of this, I think we can see everywhere, and not least in climate change. And now we're having a very interesting moment of crisis, right? Extinction Rebellion. There's all these kinds of things, which is talking to a different risk level. And I mean, I think there's a number. If you accept climate change, a 33% chance of meeting 1.5 or 2 degrees as a risk level, you're willing to take whatever measures, right? That's accepting the same risk level as jumping on a plane, knowing there's going to be 30,000 plane crashes every day. We would never do that, right? So it's kind of, I guess my question or point is, how do you see the interface between scientists and policymakers speaking to the actual severity of the crisis?
Well, there's so much.
Is there a move? Is there a shift? What's strategically the right thing?
There's loads of things in what you just said, which is. So I can only pick a few of them. I mean, the first is there is increasingly available rigour about answering some of your questions. So, for example, there's an increasing good work, often coming out of psychology. What discipline? What disciplinary background are you?
Everything.
I'll carry on. But basically, a lot of it coming out of psychology, but not exclusively, about talking about risk. So just to begin with, I think that your example of getting on a plane is entirely unhelpful. I think that I understand why you're doing it, and I guess you're doing it to make a particular point, but the questions of what's at stake and what is known and unknown, and about the choice of getting on a plane if it crashes, and versus what it means to believe a 30% chance of whatever it was that the 30% chance was about. So at least about. I'm not doing very well.
No, sorry.
The risk that you have expressed about getting on a plane is something is one that is knowable, or at least publicly a normal person would think that they knew what you meant by that. We think we know what a plane crash is, by and large. We can visualise it. And if you said there's a 30% chance of a plane crash, I would probably have a different level of trust in that as a normal human being, because actually, you know, there are quite a lot of planes flying, there's quite a lot of observable evidence about whether they crash or don't crash, and probably the situation is going to be roughly the same tomorrow as it is today, because that's a very good default assumption. So it's kind of a, you know, confidence in that 30% would be high on a number of quite good bases. The 30% in the context of climate change is really a different use of the word 30%, because I don't know what your 30%, what the two options were. 30% chance of what happening?
Well, I mean, often, for example, if you do a carbon budget, or the amount of reductions is based on.
But anyhow, my point is, 30% of anything in climate change is capable of interpretation in a myriad of different ways, which might mean very different things to people. So even if the world is incredibly bad, even if it's a disastrous scenario, it is clearly still possible for some people to believe either that it is so improbable that, unlike your airplane one, you know, this person who purports to be an expert is making statements about something which are an entirely different level of certainty and different type of knowledge, and therefore, not unreasonably, I'm not going to believe them completely. Or you can, there are evidence about the ways that people might interpret that with it. You know, the whole thing about how everybody thinks they're a better than average driver than everybody else, yeah? So I might well think, well, actually, yeah, but I have heard also, this is a kind of global statistic you've just given me, but I've also heard that, in fact, it's really just going to be the low-lying islands and, you know, bits of Africa and, so it's just such a different statement that I'm not sure it's helpful. If you really want people really to care about climate change, I'm personally not sure it's helpful to make that comparison, because I think a bit of unpacking makes it feel a bit uncomfortable. But I could be being too purist. So anyhow, can I just clarify, because you were asking about risk and new technologies. I think there's another whole set of questions. Clearly, to a certain extent, I mean, I work a lot with top scientists, right, and the most